I'm Don Featherstone, and I'm here to justify the vast sum of money that HMGS has spent bringing me over here. It may sound a bit silly, because I've been here a long time. I've been here a lot of times. But I'm always very nervous about standing here talking. I'm always a bit worried that I'm going to go on too long, or I'm going to say the wrong thing or something. But I hope that what I say will be interesting. I will be happy to answer any questions afterwards, but we'll have to come to some arrangement, because my hearing's not all that great, and I probably won't be able to hear you speaking to me from up there, but we can sort that out when we come to it. Now, I'm talking to you about 101 ways of wargaming, but right at the start I'll tell you we're cheating, because I'm only going to tell you 98 ways. Now, we like to go around, or people in the hobby like to go around, believing and postulating the theory that wargaming is a realistic simulation of combat performed on a miniature battlefield. But you've got to bear in mind that it's only a partial resemblance to real-life warfare for one single reason: the absence of the fear factor. It's a game, and it can't be anything more than a game because of this lack of fear. In real warfare, and I speak from experience, everything you do, everything you movement, every thought, everything you say is conditioned by fear. I spent 6.5 years, 4.5 of which in the army, 4.5 of which were in a state of intense terror. And you don't get that in wargaming. You can't compare standing at a wargames table with being on a battlefield. Even when it's as realistic as old Duke Cypress's table up there, with all the Pathans screaming and roaring in the background. Real war has apprehension. You're wet, you're muddy, you're cold, you're being shelled, there's rumours around, we're going home, we're going in tomorrow, we're pulling out, we're doing this, we're doing that. You lose your friends. You imagine fighting World War II or post-World War II warfare on a war games table, and you're doing it with tanks and armour. Well, I mean, moving a little plastic tank, a little metal tank across the table is very, very different from standing in the turret there of a Churchill or something, with your driver there and your co-driver there, and you nudge him with your foot to tell him which way you want him to go, and there's your gunner by your side, and your radio operator loader down there, and you're operating the turret, which is traversing, and you've got your head out, and somebody's taking shots at you and everything. It's a little bit different to what we're trying to do, and this has to be appreciated. You can't really simulate a war game and bring into it real life conditions with painful punishments of failure. The only two things that have ever been put to me that can simulate fear in wargaming. There's one of your countrymen once, when I used to write Wargaming's newsletter, one of your countrymen put a theory forward that the way to fight war games was to have your troops going forward in a normal way, and if one of his regiments routed one of yours, you picked them up and gave them to him, and he put them on the floor and jumped on them. If they cost a lot of money, you've been painting them for a long time, that instills fear into you. The other way is, of course, if you come out wrong on the sticky end of the dice, then the guy across the table can start to lean over and punch you in the face. I've never seen anybody fight at a war game, but I suppose it must happen at times. So right, let's get right down to the beginning. Now, to fight war games, you've got to have a war games room, haven't you? Now, war games rooms come in all shapes and sizes. And I'm very impressed over here with your cellars where you've got your war games rooms, which are your war games rooms. And I said this at a convention, I think it was in Kansas City the other year. I was talking about this, and I said, you know, I wonder why you've got these marvellous cellars and we haven't got them in Britain. And a great chorus came up, because you don't have typhoons. You see, well, I mean, this may be right, but I was up in Iowa in Omaha in April when I was over here at Call to Arms, and I went to Ken Bunga, the Wargamer's house. Now, I've never seen anything like it. I mean, most of my friends in England don't even live in such palatial surroundings as his war games room and area. He's got a basement with a suite of 5 rooms devoted to wargaming. He's got this vast table, which I'm going to mention later on. He's got this terrific library taking up 2 rooms. And he challenged me to mention any book, and I mentioned 2 or 3 quite esoteric books, and he had them all. And he'd got all these figures there, and he'd got comfortable settees and chairs, and there were 12 of us there, and we were all comfortably seated. Now this is real luxury. I remember when I first started, when I got married, we, you know, like you do, you look around for a house, and you get one house, and then you get a bit better. And in Southampton in England, we found this Victorian house, built in about 1890 something, and it was a nice house, and we were shown over it, and it was partially empty. We were shown over it, and it had 2 lots of stairs, front stairs and a little flight of stairs at the back, because when the house was built, it had servants, and the servants used to live in some quarters at the top of these stairs, and they used to come down the stairs to the kitchen, you see. Well, at the top of these stairs, we go around the house, at the top of these stairs we went up, and round a corner, round that one there, and there was a door, and I opened it, and there was this room with some steps down inside it. I stood there, and I could see it peopled with model soldiers, war games tables and shelves and everything. I don't think I'd seen any more of the house. I told my wife, yeah, I think we'll buy this. I lived there for 24 years, and that war games room became quite famous in its way. We had British television up there. I remember we had about 10 people and a couple of cameras crowded in there once, and some quite well-known British celebrities up there. There's a guy today making films, a director called John Borman, who's done quite a lot of films. Got one out recently, which has been reviewed in England recently. And John Borman came up and interviewed me, I remember, for one of the local television companies, and then we went out and dined afterwards, and had some very interesting talks about it. He's gone a long way in the world. I wrote him after his film Hope and Glory came out, and he wrote me a very nice letter back. And you remember the day we sat and ate tripe and onions in a restaurant in Southampton, because neither of us had ever eaten tripe and onions before. I don't know whether this is a peculiarly British dish or whether any of you have tried it, but I wouldn't recommend it. So you've got to have a war game room. Now, 9 times out of 10, it's one of the spare bedrooms. You prevail upon your wife to let you have, only for a little while, dear. You know, we're about 15 years later, she's agitating trying to get it back. Well, I'm in a very invidious position, because I live in a smaller house now, and I've got a great big war games loft, which you climb up a ladder to. That was another thing. As soon as I saw this house, I looked at this dank old loft, and I could see war games rooms again. And I had it all done and lighting and everything, and we climb up to this loft, you see. But I've also got a big study in one of the spare bedrooms, and I'm a physical therapist, so I've also got a clinic in another room with lamps and couches and things. So my wife is a very hard put upon lady. Tables. Now you've got to have a war games table. Now how big should your war games table be? Well, I always had a feeling that the optimum size of war games table, the optimum width, has got to be 6 feet, so as you can reach the middle. Now, I have seen that I've seen that fact refuted twice. I saw it years and years ago when Brigadier Peter Young, who was a good friend of mine in England, Peter Young had a table that was 20 feet square. See, and when I looked at this table, Peter Young was a fantastic character. I mean, you never knew when you had a war game with him whether he was going to cut your throat or move his soldiers or what, because he was the complete commando type. He said to me once, my misfortune was I was born out of my time. I should have been born 200 years ago. He said I'd have ruled the Spanish Main with Henry Morgan. And he would have done too. He had this 20-foot table, you see, and you'd move your figures, and then when you wanted to move some that were out of reach, you got under the table and you lifted up a hatch and poke your head out in your hands. You see, well, you know, Peter Young had vanished. You'd be, all of a sudden he'd appear over there. He'd beam at you. Just moving my figures, dear boy. You see, he'd move his figures about twice the regulation distance, then pull yours over and push them back out of the way. The other one I saw was in Omaha, Omaha, at Ken Bunger's place where I was selling just now. Now he's got this, I don't know, any of you been to his place? Well, you know it, don't you? He's got this huge, great long table. Well, it must be 20 feet, I should think. It's very, very wide, and it's split in two, so you walk up the middle of it like going up the aisle at church. And you walk up the middle of it, and as the table is like this, and there's two halves there, and you're walking up there, that flank and that flank are synonymous, really. You really, if you put the table together, that unit would have its flank across there, you see. And it seems to work all right, and it's very impressive. How long should a table be? Well, ideally it should be good and long, so you can have some good battles right across it, or you can have some esoteric things coming all the way down. I mean, you've got to have a lot of time for that. But one of the things about wargaming that is unreal as well is that every war game we have, every situation involves the end of the world. There's the end of the world there, and there's the end of the world there. I mean, guys who believe in the flat earth policy love wargaming tables. We could have round wargaming tables. We could go around. It would be a little bit more realistic, but quite impracticable. What height should it be, a wargames table? Well, it should be of a height where you can bend over it without needing the services of people like myself, physical therapists, to put your disc back in. A good height, really, I think, is about the height of this table. But some people have them very low, and you sort of admittedly you can reach the middle better. But well, the height, I suppose, is dependent on your physical dimensions. If you're tall, you have a different height to if you're very small. I remember a guy once who was very, very keen on wargaming, and he couldn't have a wargames room. He lived in a small condominium with his wife, and he managed to prevail upon it. Sometimes you can get wives to be so amenable, can't you, about things, especially about your hobbies. And this guy had a big double bed in the bedroom. It's quite high, it was an old house, quite high. And there was the bed. The bed head was represented by the bottom of a wargames table, which was hinged. And the wargames table is to lie against the wall, so you're lying in bed like that, and that wall is a wargames table. And the underside of it had all decorations and wallpaper on it. And when you wargame, you let it down and pulled some legs out, and there was this wargames table, and there was a bed underneath. Handy to put the boxes of figures on. Sand tables. I don't know whether anybody has sand tables anymore, but when I was started wargaming, sand tables became all the rage. I think this is possibly because some of us have, in those days, some of us have been in the army, and you have sand tables in the army where they demonstrate what's supposed to happen but never does. I had a sand table. I remember this thing, and it was very strongly built and had sides there, and I carted sand up my little back stairs and poured it on, and it seemed to be all right. You could mould. The only trouble was that if you to make different coloured terrain on it, I used to spray the sand or throw stuff into the sand to make green for this or yellow for wheat food or something. Well, of course, when you make a new one, you sort of mulch it all up together again, and the table gradually assumed a weird composite sort of surrealistic colour, like anything natural. And the biggest trouble I found with sand tables was you lose troops. And you're fighting a Mulburian battle, all of a sudden a machine gun nest turns up. Two funny things about sand tables that related to characters in my experience. There used to be one of the very earliest wargamers in Britain, even before I started, was a lovely man called Ed Saunders. Well, Ed Saunders was a very rough diamond type of guy. He drove a truck and he lived down in Taunton in Somerset. And Ed Saunders had this little, what we call a council house in England. They little small houses, and the local council build them and you pay rent for them. And he had one of these council houses, and I wasn't allowed to do too much to it, you see. So he phoned me up one day, he said, "When you're coming down my way, sir, I've got a sand table." I said, "You've got a sand table?" I'd never seen one before I had one. So I went rushing down to Taunton, which was by my standards of 70 miles, was quite a long way, but by your standards, just a ways up the road. And I went down there, and I went, "Come on, Ed, where is it?" So we go outside, and we walk round the house, and there above the wall was this little door thing, patch of old chipboard or something there. And it was about, I suppose it was about like the size of a dog kennel, this entrance. I suppose it was about 2'6" high and about that wide. So he moved this board, and feet first, he slithered down in. "Come on," he said, and I slithered down in. He had gone underneath the house and taken all the earth out, so that there was just the footings there and the floorboards and the rafters, these things over his head there. He said, well, he was a little fella and he could walk around right, but I had to keep going to the rafter. And he got this table there, this sand table there, and he got all this sand down there, and there was a big hole at one end. So I said, what happened there, a crater or something? No, he said, I had to do a concrete job on the step and I wanted some sand. Then there was another crazy guy called Bill Gunson. He used to come on Wargaming from Kuwait. Now, Bill Gunson had a good job in Kuwait, one of the oil companies. And he earned a lot of money. He used to spend a lot of money too. And he was the craziest guy I've ever known in Wargaming. He used to descend on you with his wife and family. He used to come over from Kuwait for 2 or 3 months. He used to descend on you with his wife and family, all weird hours, about 11 o'clock at night. And there was talk around at one stage of giving a campaign medal to any English wargamers who had given her hospitality to Bill Gunson and his friend and his family. Bill Gunson rented a house at a place called Fort Maddock in Wales, which is a small seaside village, you see. And he had this house on the sort of down on the front there, and there was a beach down there. And he wanted a war games table. So he sends his 2 sons down onto the beach. He's got a bucket and a rope, and up in the room above, he's made this great table. He hammered and banged around. He wasn't a very practical bloke because the sort of job he had enabled him to tell people, Arabs and people out in Kuwait, to do this and do that, because he didn't have to do it himself. So he wasn't really very good at doing things. So he made this big table, and then he spent all one morning lowering this thing, and his sons would fill it up with sand, and he'd pull it up and put it on the table. So at lunchtime, there he is, he's got a sand table. He looks at it, and his wife says, lunch is ready. Okay, don't come down. So he goes down, they're sitting there having lunch, and the ceiling collapses. They're all getting covered in sand, and one end of the room goes down, all the sand comes pouring down. That was one of the standing jokes of the period. Now, terrain. Terrain really separates the men from the boys, doesn't it? I mean, you go along and look at old Duke's Archery stuff along there, and you go home and you kick all your stuff in the corner, don't you? I mean, it depends on a certain sort of aesthetic attitude to it, I suppose. Somebody said to me, oh no, but Hal Thingland wrote in his magazine recently that the least interesting thing about wargaming was actually fighting the battles. Well, I suppose in a way, your good set's a bit of a bore, having to move more, and you paint them and you bar them and you collect them and you make the change. Well, making terrain is great fun, isn't it? And we'd all like to have marvellous looking terrain pieces. And I've seen some wonderful stuff over the years. I'm not very happy about these interlocking terrain tiles you get, because unless the table has got a ledge around it, they seem to me to keep moving around. But I think that if you can make squares, Peter Gilder used to do it with squares. He was in the Duke's Archery class with terrain. You make these squares and then you can fit them all. And Duke was just telling me there, he's got this battle today and he's got another one tomorrow. He says, all I do, he said, is take the square out and put down and that one round there. He said, it's a bit like drafts, I suppose, or some game where you keep on altering things around and they all fit in. And providing you've got all your roads and all your rivers coming off at the same point on the end of the square, so I say, yeah, you're all right. I've got beyond the storage is a problem with those really though, isn't it? You make them and then you store them in a corner and then you've got the bits that stand up and get broken and knocked off and everything. But I've got down in recent years, I've got very, very thick green baize and I've got a huge great cloth and I stretch it over the table and I just put shapes underneath it, and then when I've got it a shape with the contours I want, the topography I want, I just throw handfuls of different coloured stuff on it, you know, to make it look realistic. And you've got your roads and you put them down and everything. It works quite well. And before that, we got great plastic sheets of a very malleable plastic, very sort of loose, easy plastic. And we used to paint with poster paint rivers and roads on it. That was quite practical. And that used to look quite good, because you could do quite a good job with a brush and paint a nice little road with ditches along the side and everything. Houses, villages, towns, well, you've seen it downstairs and the diggings area there. You can buy beautiful houses, you can buy big houses, little houses, but really, when you come to think of it, the actual houses we use in our war games are really out of scale, aren't they? I mean, you take a village, a normal village, I'm thinking more of an English village now because I'm more familiar with them. I thought, you take a normal village and you're using that in a battle, then that village would be very, very easily garrisoned by perhaps a company of men. You wouldn't even need a regiment. But in a war game, you've got house there and house there and house there, and about a third of the table is taken over. You tend to find that you've got a regiment there and a regiment here and a regiment there, but it's unrealistic. So later on I'm going to tell you a way that we think we've overcome that in our local war games. And very interestingly, on the subject of villages and that in warfare, I was in Tidworth near Salisbury Plain last year. I was invited to a firepower demonstration when the British Army fired all the weapons they'd got, from catapults to pea shooters. And after that we were driven along from Tidworth to Andover. And as we drove along the road, all of a sudden on the left I saw this ridge and this village on it. And I never remember seeing that before. And the driver turned up and we went up there. And the army have built, about 8 or 9 years ago, built a village, a complete village with church, town square and everything, on the lines of a village from one of the North German Plains villages. And there it is, it's very continental, and nobody lives there, and they fight with it. And we watched them do some street fighting. The regiments go there, and the battalions go there and do street fighting. We did watch them doing some abseiling from the church there. And the officer who runs the place, who was a power officer, said to me that there is never a weekend passes, he said, without some motorist come riding up from the main road below and ask if they can see the show house. Because everybody thinks it's a new complex, a new village with new houses, which is springing up all over the place in England. They probably are here. Another thing about fighting with buildings, I remember, haven't done this, but I remember once seeing somebody, and his whole war games table, he'd made it into a house, or into a series of houses, cut off at the first floor level, so that you look down on it and there's a room and there's a wall and there's another room there, and they're all empty, there's furniture and everything in them, and he had this fighting from room to room with troops banging holes in walls and all that sort of thing to go through. I've never done it, but it looked quite interesting. Soldiers, figures, the figures we use, well, you know, you take your choice. There's various scales and various styles. When I first started, the guy I started with, Tony Bath, was using flats. Well, I don't know if anybody ever uses flats anymore, but they were interesting because the thing about flats was you could get a flat figure for any period, any position, anything you wanted. But they were absolute buggers to paint, and I didn't like them when you looked at them frontwards and they vanished. No, flats weren't really my style. I started off round about the time, well, soon after I started, Airfix figures came in. But when I started off, there was only Jack Scrooby and Britain's making figures. Well, of course, you could have your 54s, and they looked all right to a point. And there's still a lot of fellas fighting around with 54s. There's a lad, I was looking at his stuff down in the Call to Arms recently, Ken Van Pelt down there. And he uses big sort of home cast figures, about 54mm, and they're half rounds. They're not like sort of British figures, they're half rounds and they're very good. And you can use the big 54s for individual skirmish stuff. I bought a lot of Elastin figures, Landsknechts and all that, and we use those for individual skirmish, cowboys and that, and they look very good. You can go right down the scale to the smallest size figures, like my GHQs figures. I was very impressed with Greg Scott showing me the GHQ figures, the little American Civil War figures and little gun scenes and everything. I mean, they're all right to run, they've got to paint them, but I thought they looked very good. Painting, well, you can be a perfectionist, you can paint so that each one is a work of art, or you can paint so that when you pick them up, each figure, as I say, is an individual, and then perhaps you base them, or you can paint en masse. Now, I'm not a very good painter, so I used to go for effect en masse. I would base my figures about 3 to a base there, and when they all set up, in the distance they looked quite reasonable. They had white trousers, red tops or something, you know. And they satisfied me because I'm an impatient sort of a bugger, and I've got a lot of other things to do, so I put up with that. But that's every man to his choice, does whatever he wants to. Regimental blocks, I'm going to discuss those later, so I won't go to those now. Ground scale, I never really got to grips with ground scale. I know people who worry themselves to death with it, but I don't know. If you're going to have ground scale, then you've got to go the whole hog, haven't you? And coming back to your villages, you're never going to really get into to accurate ground scale on a war games table, it's if you're going to have houses all over the place on it. Frontages are interesting. If you go to Agincourt, I'm saying this because this is the best example I know of frontage. You go to Agincourt, you can pace across that battlefield between the Tramcore woods on your right and the Agincourt woods on your left, and you know that on the day of the battle it's about 976 yards across when Henry V's archers were in position with their stakes there and they fought the French back. And you know that. And you know that Henry V had 6,000 men, 1,000 men at arms and 5,000 archers. You know that because if you go to the Public Records Office in London at Kew, you can go up the desk and ask them and they will produce the lists written on the day on parchment in archaic sort of writing and everything of Henry V's order of battle for that day. You can see it there. And it's fascinating really because there's all the men's names. And I took a photocopy of one particular banner by Sir Roger de Keeley from up north there, and he had his men at arms out from his archers and everything. And I took a list and I put them in alphabetical order, you see. And it's wonderful. They're English names. There's Allen, Allenson, Benson, Baines, Dobson, all these sort of names, you see. And it's really fascinating. And I've said this before, a lot of you probably heard me say it, that if you have a name, if you come from English-speaking stock, you're American, you're Canadian, you're Australian, whatever, and you have a name that is on one of those lists of Henry V's army at Agincourt, then reasonably you can say that you had an ancestor at Agincourt. Because there were only about 6 million people in Britain at the time, small population, and we've all sort of, well, most of us have come from, I said the British stuff have come from that anyway. And I remember saying that once, I believe it was in this very room, and somebody was out there saying, my name's Dobson, why? And then I had the list, I said, yeah, sure, and it went on like that. And then afterwards, the little guy came up to me and he stood there, and he said, am I on the list? So I said, I don't know, what's your name? He said, Schwarzkopf, or something like that. Basing figures. Well, I know a lot of people now, how England does, and a lot of people I see around, you base figures singly on washers and things like that. Well, that's all right if you're taking cases off the table, but I very early found in my wargaming life that removing cases is one of the biggest bores ever, because in the end, after a little while, you get a regiment down to 2 men and a dog, and it looks ridiculous. we have a system in my wargaming where we don't remove figures. We work on the basis that everything that happens to soldiers affects their morale, whether it's the effect of fire, the effect of melee, or whatever. It affects their morale, and that affects the unit as a whole. So every time anything happens to them, we put an attrition tick against the name of them on the list, and we give that number of squares. I mean, the guards perhaps have got 8 squares, the militia have got 6 squares, and lesser lights have got even less squares. And when the time you've filled up all your squares, you take the unit off the table completely. And that obviates you keep most of your units on the table all the time. So therefore, you don't go through life painting laboriously and then taking the bloody things off the table all the time so that they're underneath it, which we found quite well. Armies, they're unrealistic in a sense because of their small scale. I mean, you can try and refight, for example, you can refight Salamanca, and unless you've got a big table and a hell of a lot of figures, you're only doing it figuratively, really. You can get the same sort of style of fighting, the same results, you can do the same manoeuvres. The size of the battlefield, of course, and the availability of the figures has a big bearing on this. You can get the order of battle for a battle, and you look at it, and it horrifies you at first. I mean, if you go through books like Oman's books on the Peninsular War, and most of Oman's orders of battle have been reproduced in the book on the Peninsular War that I did for Todd Fisher's Emperor's Press. And you can look down those and you can get thoroughly disheartened at the number of units such and such a brigade has got so many, this and this and this, you know. And I was reading in a magazine here that somebody gave me here, I was only reading this last night, and a guy in it said that it wasn't practical to fight war games under brigade level. And if you fought with battalions, then you got down to nitty gritty, and it was messy. If you fought at brigade level, probably wasn't quite as realistic. I didn't really read the thing terribly thoroughly, but if you fought at brigade level, you had reasonable sized formations, and it wasn't so messy. You can have any period you like for wargaming, but one thing you've got to remember about periods of wargaming, that you are fighting a wargame with hindsight and a knowledge of tactics that was completely denied to the commanders of the day. Now, I was sitting at breakfast forum with Bob Jones and we were talking about this, and I think it's quite possible that you take some of the historic battles going right back through the ages and you know what happened, and you can look at them and you can say, shouldn't have done that, shouldn't have done this. Well, other factors aside, such as fear and anxiety, there are a lot of commands in warfare and historical warfare which would have been better carried out by experienced wargamers. They would have done it more sensibly because they have hindsight and they have a knowledge of fighting that was denied those commanders. So it's no good fighting, what shall we say, pike and shot battles and using tactics that would have done credit to people in World War I or World War II. You've got to be realistic with it. You've got to try and get your mind back. This is one of the fascinations of wargaming, that you've got to study and read if you want to do it properly and accurately. I won't bother to go into all the different periods you can do, even if we go right down to fantasy and naval, but you know as well as I do that there's a hell of a lot of choice, isn't there? And for each one of them you've got to find your armies, buy them, paint them, put them into formation and everything. It seems to me, from what I've seen around here, that there isn't any period or anything that you can't buy model soldiers for nowadays. When I first started wargaming, I had some SAE, Swedish African Engineers figures, which I converted laboriously into American Civil War figures, and then I found Scrooby, and I used to get his figures, but they got very expensive because I had to pay customs duty and everything on them. Then I found a guy in England called Spencer Smith who did plastics, which were cast from figures made by a Swede called Holger Eriksson. Holger Eriksson had a factory in Ireland, then he had a factory in Madeira, then he had a factory in Trivia in Cape Town in South Africa, and then this guy Spencer Smith came along in England and started putting them out as plastics. And Spencer Smith used to go around like a man with a guilty secret, under the impression, I think, that some attorneys were going to turn round from some corner representing Holger Eriksson and put their hand on his shoulder and say, we're having you for plagiarism or copying or infringement of copyright or something. Anyway, you could get these figures and they were quite good, they were cheap, and I liked them. And I still like plastic figures, and when you look around at some of the figures, Revell and Atlantic and those sort of things, they're very good and the definition on them is very good. And if you base them right, the only trouble is that I find, I don't know whether it's peculiar to the figures I got, but if you leave them a long time, maybe your wargaming West holding them, that they snap off at the base. And I always say to my guys, we've been recently fighting French and Indian wars, and I got a lot of these Indians and all that sort of thing, and I say to them, now look, for God's sake, when you pick them up, don't pick them up sideways and squeeze them. Pick them up from the front and put them down. And there's always something like, sorry, Don, there's a couple of figures broken off there, but it's just one of those things. And Peter Gilder and I, when we started, I met Peter Gilder after I've been wargaming a year or so, and he was possibly the leading person in the wargaming world in Britain, in my opinion. He did more to further the hobby, really, in a practical sense than anybody, much like old Duke over here. And he and I spent a lot of time, him up in the Eastern Counties and me back in Southampton there. And in those days, Airfix turned out, the first thing ever turned out, I don't really remember, was a Guards band. And this box with a Guards band. Well, we bought hundreds of boxes of Guards bands, and we sawed off trombones of things and turned them into American Civil War armies with Confederates and Federals. And in the end, Peter Gilder had my share of them, and he had both of them. And then, at some stage, I don't know what, he sold them to Neville Dickinson, the miniature figurines. And I said to Neville the other week, whatever happened to those Civil War armies you bought off Peter Gilder? I still got them at home somewhere, but I know he never fights them. He doesn't do much wargaming, and he sells figures. Right, what sort of war you're going to fight? You're going to fight a fictional war? Or you're going to fight the great battle of a banana with Zulus coupled with Pathans fighting against this massed army of Prussians and French? Or what are you going to do? Are you going to fight Waterloo, Gettysburg? Or you're going to go back to H.G. Wells' Hook's Farm from Little Wars. I don't think you've ever fought that. We had a convention, the very first convention we ever had in England, and we refought Hook's Farm from H.G. Wells' book, with using exactly the same Britain's figures that we managed to collect and firing at them with 4.7 naval guns and bits of wood. It was great fun. Yeah. When we first started wargames, Tony Barker and I, we used to fight on the floor. And he had all these flats. We used to fight with them before I got there. And I had, I don't know if you remember this, there used to be, when I was a boy, I don't know whether they're still around, Britons used to make a howitzer. And it had a shell that formed into two. And it had three ranges, this shell, 6 foot, 9 foot and 12 foot, according to what sort of spring was in the base. And you get the cap and you screw it on, and you stick it inside the breech, shut the breech, something, and it used to go boom like that, you see. And if you had whatever you had on it, it'd go 12 feet, 9 feet, or 6 feet, you see, and it was pretty good. Well, our rules used to allow you, regardless of what period you fight, used to allow you 1 shot per move with this howitzer. That's a marvellous job on a mashed ranks of flats. How it's a shell coming over. We all have favourite battles. You can pick battles in history that you really like. Salamanca's a lovely battle to fight, which I'm going to go into in one of my other talks. I won't go into it now. I get around quite a bit of battlefields, and I'm very fond of the Peninsular War. And I've been to Spain and Portugal. And just outside Almeida, Crawford had his light division position, and he was luxuriating in being there. He shouldn't really be there, he was too far forward. Wellington wasn't very happy, but Crawford was a bit of a toughie, and I don't think Wellington wanted to confront him and say, pull them back, Bob. Anyway, they were allowed to stay there. Well, they realised that they were out on a limb, and he put a very big attack in on them. And we've been to this field, and it's completely unchanged. You've got the windmill there where the left flank was, and you've got the little ruined houses where I think it was the 43rd were in these houses, and they got trapped and they had to break the walls down to get out. And you've got the track down where the French cavalry came galloping down along the rear, sabring as they went along. You've got the curved road there, and you've got the bridge across the river. And this bridge, it's sort of, because it goes over and round and back like that, it's a weird bridge. And it was during the battle, it was complicated by an ammunition wagon overturned. They got jammed on it, and Crawford retreated very skillfully back there, and he had two parts of the light division up on 2 mounds covering the retreat. Well, after the retreat, they'd gone over the bridge, they pulled these 2 back, and then they found that the 52nd was still down there trying to get along on the enemy side of the river. So Beckwourth took his lot back, recaptured the hills, held them again, allowed the 52nd to get over. Then the light division massed on the slopes behind the bridge. Ney attacked over the bridge, and they just kept firing and firing and firing until the bridge was full of bodies right up to the top of the parapet. And that is a wonderful battle to fight. If you go to the battlefield now, they've built an arterial road, and there's a great big bridge across by the side. They've left the original bridge up, but that is a very stimulating battle. There was another battle fought in the 100 Years' War at Auberoche in 1346, I think it was, when the British came through some woods and attacked the French in camp. And I can't remember the full details of that, but that is a glorious battle, and we have refought that. In fact, in one of my books I did a thing called Battles for All Seasons, and I described this as it was fought in the 100 Years' War, as it would have been fought by the Light Division of the Peninsular War, and then we had it being fought by Paras, by Windy Gales Paras in World War II. And it's a lovely battle, and you can do that with battles. You can transform, as I'm sure you've mostly done, you can transform the background to a battle to another age or period, and it works very successfully. I felt for a long time at one stage that computers would revolutionise wargaming. Not sort of computer games or anything, but in that they would so happily produce the results that we so laboriously find out we're throwing dice on it. And I had the opportunity to find out. There was a guy who's been over here a few times who has fallen upon shady time, a guy called Danny Boreham, some of you may know him. And Danny Boreham ran a firm called Battle Honours, I think, in Britain. And he devised this computer wargame thing. And we went out to to Duke's place at Fox Hollow, Wisconsin one night, and we did it there. And then I went to a convention thing he held in England. And now the thing about this was, there were these two lads with this computer. We did Albuera. And you all had your units. I think they had a brigade or division each, you see. Now the thing started. We started on this end. And the guy with the computer, or the mastermind, says, what do you want to do with those? So we're going to fire them. So right. You see, and they put it in the computer. And then they tell the other guy what his losses are. But you don't know them. And this goes on right the way along. And at later stages in the battle, you say, I'm going to fire those. You say, they look at it, you can't fire them, you see. Well, you don't know why you can't fire, but you presume it's because you've had heavy losses or something has happened to you, see. And this goes along. Well, it's good because you don't know what's going on, but they had one computer, and there were about 12 of us playing, 6 aside, and it took about a quarter of an hour for each one's formation to do. They'd do mine, and they'd do Charlie's, and so on and on. Then they go along there, and you're all standing waiting and watching like that. And the rules of the game, well, you weren't to talk. You mustn't converse. So, you know, the whole thing dragged a bit, but I thought the idea behind it was quite good. I don't know anything about computers, but it strikes me that if you could do something that would do it all at once, I don't know whether that's possible, but I thought it would be quite a good thing. Now, what sort of war games are you going to fight? Well, you can fight solo war games. There's the lonely war gamer. You can fight things, you can cheat yourself. You can start it and go up and do a quarter of an hour and come downstairs, and you can keep this thing going, and you can write your rules and you don't argue with anybody, and it all seems perfect. But I always found solo war games just a little bit heartless and soulless. But as you know, there's a Solo War Games Association in Britain. They put out a magazine called Lone Warrior, and everybody seems perfectly happy and content with it. I think it's a good thing if you're living in the wild, you're absolutely on your own, there's nobody near, or it might be a good thing as an associated activity to your other wargaming. If, for example, you're a fervent wargamer and you only get a chance to fight once a month, right, you might feel inclined to take up solo wargaming. I am an advocate of what is known as parochial wargaming. I have got 5 guys who come to me every Wednesday night, and we fight to my rules, and I pick what we're going to fight and stick the stuff out. Sometimes I say, what do you want to do next week, lads? You know, and we say, well, let's do Romans and Gauls or something. And we fight the same group all the time. Now, this is the epitome of sociable, friendly comradeship that wargaming is noted for, in my opinion. And those guys come along there, and we have one rule about all our games. I have to finish at 9:45 so that we can get up the road to the pub before it closes. And if I can be serious, man, I'll give you an idea about how long I know. My son, when he was 2, he used to come up these back stairs I've told you about to the war games. He used to climb up to the boys up the stairs, and he'd come down the stairs in the war games, and he'd stand and he couldn't see, so they'd lift him up and he'd look at these figures and everything. Well, as the years went by, he became a war game chef and everything, and he was killed when he was 28, and those same 5 guys that used to lift him up to look came to his funeral 26 years later, and they're still, that was 5 years ago, and they're still at my house, and they were there the Wednesday last week before I came over. That's exactly the same guys. That's parochial wargaming, and I don't really fight anything, partly because I can't understand anybody else's rules. Club wargaming and convention wargaming. Convention wargaming is here, we've seen it all, and people queuing up to get in battles, and everybody's apparently having a fairly good time. I haven't seen anybody fighting or anything, everybody seems to be playing and enjoying themselves. Club wargaming, we started a club in the 1960s in Southampton, and the very first thing we did, we called it the Wessex War Games Club, and we used to have a meeting every Saturday afternoon, and we'd have a speaker come down. We had them all, David Chandler and all sorts of Bill Palmer and all sorts of well-known military people in those days, and they used to come and talk to us, and then at 4:30 we'd then war game for the rest of the day, you see. Well, my son and a lot of the other younger members didn't go much on these guys talking to them, setting up good wargaming time. So we had an annual general meeting one year, and the kids had perpetrated a coup d'etat. They voted us all out. I was voted out to being the secretary, and the chairman was voted out, and they all took over. And the first end of the passage was going to be no speakers, wargaming all the afternoon. So the senior guys myself, with good spirit, we fight upon and called ourselves the Wessex Military Society and carried on with a luncheon club that just had a speaker, and we didn't do any public war game. But the very first war game we ever did with that club, I remember, we did an English Civil War game. And everybody was asked, who wanted to take part, everybody was asked to provide a force. They could provide 3 units. You could have 3 infantry units, you could have an infantry unit, a cavalry unit, a gun, you could have 3 guns, you could have anything you wanted, provided it was free. Now you got the figures, you got the stuff, you painted them yourself and you turned up and everything. Now this was a very interesting thing, because straight away we saw reflected the whims and the attitudes of society, because all the guys there who voted Conservative for Maggie Thatcher, or whoever was the Prime Minister at that time, they all picked the Cavaliers, the Royalists, you see, and all the guys of left-wing tendencies became Roundheads. Very, very interesting. And we had a guy, a member called Alistair Malpass, who was a major, he was in the Anglian Regiment, and he was posted, he was in Germany, and every week he would send us details of a battle, you see. And there was always some sort of a battle where there would be an attacking side and a defending side. And the defending side was always smaller than the attacking side, you see. So on the night or on the day, when you came along, you'd say, right, how many Cavaliers have we got? How many Rounders have we got? So you've got 20 units of Cavaliers, right. 14 units of Rounders, right. Rounders, you're defending, we're attacking, you see. And you have this battle, and you give 2 points for win, 1 point for draw. Well, I mean, this went on for about 2 years, this thing. And the very, very first battle, my lot, I was a Cavalier. My lot did a marvellous cavalry charge, and Rupert led a marvellous cavalry charge, and we won, and we got 2 points. But every other battle after that was a draw. Every single battle was a draw after that. So when we finished the league table at the end, it was Plate 15, Cavaliers 29 points, Roundheads 28. Oh no, we won by 1 point. And that it was very good fun the way that went. Postal wargaming, I've never done, but I can see the point of it. If you've got a mate and he moves away, or you're in the army or something, and you send each other instructions, I can see that's quite good. Individual skirmish wargaming, I think is great fun. When old Mike Blake and Ian Colwell and Steve, the lad who was in the wheelchair there, when they devised individual skirmish wargaming, they really did wargaming a good turn. And Mike Blake is still going strong with it in England. I saw him at a convention the other day. He's fatter and got a bigger beard, but he's still doing it. And they've got these wonderful narratives, haven't they, with these individual skirmishes. I remember we've done the OK Corral fight and all that sort of thing. I remember I was a gun-toting gambler in one game, and I got across the street with the sheriff after me, and I got the town drunk in front of me, and I went across the street behind the town drunk, all, across the table with these figures. And there is a lot going for it. And I did a book on it, and there's a lad over here who is reproducing this book. We got the contract someone. I haven't seen him actually since I've been here, but he's supposed to be reproducing individual skirmish over here in the next few weeks. Airborne games. We did Arnhem once, we did Arnhem more than once, but on one particular occasion, and what we did with airborne games, we made the Arnhem people. We had all the Germans already from other games, these are all airfix figures. And we did British 1st Airborne, and Taylor and Boy Gavin's 8800, it was 88, 82nd, I remember that, 82nd, and 101st there. And what we did, we split each thing up into groups. We had sections, a section of men, a machine gun team, a mortar team, a light piece of artillery and so on, you see, and everything got a number. And then we got, those little pieces of paper when you punch holes in paper and all the little bits come out. We got hundreds of those, and we laboriously put this number on one of these, so that we had dozens of numbered little tiny circles of paper. Then we got a model aeroplane, quite a big model aeroplane, and we made a hole in the bottom of it, and we stuffed all these things in, held the airplane like that, you see. So held the airplane back like that because the holes in the front. So as long as you held the airplane like that, all the paper stayed in it. Then you took the airplane across the table, and at a given moment you went like that, and all this stuff fluttered out all over the place, you see. And then when you picked it up and you saw 47, mortar team, you put 47 down, you see. Well, the first time we did Arnhem, true to life, the whole bloody lot dropped on 2 German armoured divisions hidden in the wood. It was chaos trying to sort it out. that was great fun. You know, the things you can do, they're mind-boggling, aren't they? You can do almost anything you want to. This is one of the beauties of this topic. Now we come to the, I don't know what to call it really, the cause of the greatest acrimony in wargaming, rules. Now you've got to have rules. I mean, there's old Bill Harting now, and he's been in the army, he knows you've got to have discipline, haven't you?
Absolutely.
You must have discipline. Well, you must have rules. Rules are the discipline of wargaming, you see. Now, the interesting thing, there are a number of common factors about rules. One is there are the same number of sets of rules as there are wargamers. You see? Two, no one has any confidence in anyone else's rules. See, you are absolutely sure that the guy who formulated those rules has got no idea of military history. He doesn't know a retreat from an advance. They're all slanted to benefit him. See, so in other words, you go into the game under a slight handicap. Commercial rules, they abound. And the thing about commercial rules, of course, to be saleable, they've got to be colourful and big and bright. And the more you put into them, the more you can charge for them. So commercial rules, they're nice, and I don't grudge a guy like Artie Cunliffe with his rules, his ancient rules, I don't even know them now. But they're well thought out and they're well done, but they're not for Featherstone. So far as I'm concerned, I don't understand anybody else's rules except my own. And that's why my rules are very, very simple. We've got one of my wargamers who's quite a big wheel in his own field. He's accountant to a British peer who owns a large estate. He runs the estate, he runs a National Motor Museum, and he's quite a hard-working big wheel. And this motor museum is a charitable organisation, so Roger spends his life going to luncheons and meetings and that, and he says to me, there were 14 people there, and I was the only one who didn't have a title. And all this sort of thing, you see. He is a very busy man. Well, we were doing one of our war games evenings one time, and take one off for this and add one on for that, all this business, you know. And he slammed the thing down. He said, I beat my brains out all day trying to earn a living. He said, I can't see much fun beating them out at night, he said, for pleasure. So we all looked at him and said, yeah, he's right. So that was a start of the renowned Featherstone on the back of a postcard rules, and you really can get one on the back of a postcard. And you see, you can only do rules if you really read your history and you know what you're doing. You can't. You can put anything you like in rules. I mean, you can make chariots carry on like tiger tanks if you want to, or anything you like, providing the guys who are using them agree with you, or the one you're doing it solo. I used to know a guy in the early days of wargaming in England. He was the archetypal Brit. He had a big moustache, and he'd been in one of the Guards regiments, you see. And he was really something, very impressive actually. I wish he was over here. He'd salute him when he walked past him. And that guy never believed in a war game that anything adverse could happen to a British unit. I mean, you'd find the Napoleonic games, you'd fight anything. He'd say, right, Howard, they got to go back. Go back? The 37th, the 37th, and they've gone back in their lives. Oh, no, something wrong with the rules. 37th wouldn't go back. And he steadfastly refused to allow him to go back. And his favourite battle was Guildford Courthouse. Because as you may remember at Guildford Courthouse, I think it was the Guards got involved in a melee, and Cornwallis turned his guns onto the melee onto both sides, and the melee was ended, and then the Guards repelled an attack later on because they were still around. He used to say, typical of Guards, it's just sort of thing they do, so it doesn't matter who's firing on you. But I mean, you know, there aren't many Howards around, so you've no need to bother, you'll come up against that. Now, another misconception about rules is that you've got to cater for every factor. Every factor must be catered for. Well, that's cobblers. Oh, sorry, that's crap. I don't know whether these terms are British or American I'm using. It's a game, and once you accept the rules, you can avert bogging down the battle. We used to do this pluses and minus business. We had these long charts. I've still got them at the time. I look at them in horizontal and I push them very quickly. You know, a +1 if the commander's within 9 inches, +2 if the sun's shining, +3 if you're behind a wall, and all that sort of business. You know the style of thing there. And it got so bad that you know what an abacus is, don't you? Mm-hmm. We made a series of abacuses. We had these little frames with wires across and coloured beads on, you see. And you'd whip a bead across one side for a plus and a bead across the other side for a minus. So at the end of the move, you'd count them all up, you see. Well, we had a guy playing with us called Peter Manning, who was a lovely fella. He was a designer for miniature figurines. He moved up north now. Now, Peter Manning, he was a natural cheat. He didn't really mean to be, it just came natural to him. If you had an 8-inch move, Peter Manning moved 9. You see. Whatever happened, Peter did a little bit better. And he, you know, when he threw, he'd try to say, 78. You sure, Pete? I'm sure. You should let me see it. Just really once in a while, he'd press something low, but not very often. So all our rules had to be Manning proof. This was a cardinal principle of rules in Southampton. Everything had to be tried and tested so that Peter Manning couldn't defeat it. He didn't always succeed, but it was quite good fun. Anyway, we had this abacus with all these things, you see, and it was going quite well for a while until we noticed that Peter Manning was down like that and all the minuses were slipping over to the plus side all the time. So I've still got the abacuses, but we don't use them. You've got to have an enjoyable game, because we're doing it for enjoyment, aren't we? I mean, we're not doing it as a labour, we're doing it as a relief from our money-earning labours of the day. And those that run, the games that run smoothly and relatively quickly, without anachronistic, petty or unrealistic situations, are the ones we're aiming for. But to try and cope with or simulate every factor, be it major or minor, it's hopeless, it's a thankless method, you can't do it. Now, you take, as an example, you take a rule that controls the reaction of a unit when a commander is nearby. Now, say he's absent. In theory, this might be realistic, but if you take it to its logical conclusion, in the light of the fact we're trying to operate as realistically as possible, why not go further? Why not discover, one, if that commander is incompetent? Is he incompetent temporarily, or is he incompetent permanently? I mean, we all know, we've all read about commanders in history, commanders we've all encountered them, who were wallies, who were nutters. And some of the things they do, I've encountered myself personally, and the trouble is in real warfare, of course, they cost men's lives. And you take people who ordered the attack on the Somme on July the 1st, 1916, when 60,000 Brits got killed in one day. I mean, there's Haig and these people back in the chateau 19 miles behind, and the Passchendaele a bit later on in the same campaign there. There was terrible losses. And Chiggle, who was Haig's chief of staff, is said to have driven through the Passchendaele battlefield and broken into tears, and he said he'd never been there. He said, did we send men through this? And you know, in warfare, it costs men's lives. So, is your commander competent? Incompetent? Is he hated by his men who lack confidence in him? And should rules be formulated to cater for those aspects? Now, we all know guys who are hated, and we know guys who might be hated, but they're respected because they're good. Now, there's famous commanders in history. They were feared by their men, but men knew they were going to handle them well, so they tolerated them. My mind, I think that the person in the world I've hated most and think was the worst man I've ever met was my regimental sergeant major. And I'm not saying that because he was my regimental sergeant major, because he was the type of guy he was, you see. And I mean, I could stand here for 2 hours and tell you stories about Bull Pastor, as he was called, that would fascinate you. You wouldn't believe me, you'd think I was making it up. But I don't suppose Tommy Lee Jones, anybody on television, Kevin Costner, could portray Bull Pastor in his full entirety as a bastard. It could be now, how do you represent a guy like that in real life on the war games table, you see? Because the commanders on the war games table are the guys opposite, aren't they? They're you and you and you, and they're quite nice, friendly sort of guys, you see. Now, it's very difficult to represent this factor of life. And if you want to have a rule that makes troops behave badly, how about having a rule that says that they haven't had any breakfast? Nothing makes men go into action more miserable than not having had any breakfast. I mean, you can put a rule down, you can toss for it, can't you? No breakfast, had breakfast, you know, and you can add or take things off their morale or whatever, compensate for that. They've got to control the rules, the historical style of fighting, and they've got to control the historic power of the weapons, and I mean, you've got to take, for example, you're fighting Middle Ages warfare. You're fighting longbows against crossbows. Longbows could keep an arrow, an archer, practiced English archer could keep an arrow in the air. By the time his first arrow in the air, he'd have another 11 off for the first arrow hit. A crossbowman had a windlass, you have to wind the thing up. You've got to reinforce that, you've got to represent that. But you can't make your rules say that your English archer has got 12 shots to your crossbowman per move, because this is anachronistic, the game would go to pieces. You've got to realise the fact that I was fighting in a war game the other week, or something about a war, I can't remember, I was watching it or fighting it, and somebody was talking about the Zulus throwing an assegai. The Zulus didn't throw assegais as a close quarter weapon. They used to come in with their shield and push it like the shield and come in with it low. You see, and another thing that rules you've got to reflect, you've got to reflect the unfortunate situation that primitive peoples, their courage was not enough in the face of modern military firepower. Now, I write a lot of books about colonial wars and all that, and they're a bit unpopular these days. And I did some books called Castles, called Victorian Colonial Campaigns, and I did one on Africa and one on India, and there were two more to do. Well, after the second one came out, Castles received a letter from the Afro-Asian and Caribbean Cultural Support Group, Malik somebody and Tariq somebody else, you see, in which they said they were astonished that a reputable firm like Castles should publish work by such a rabid xenophobist and racist as Featherstone. And they had 39 questions on 7 pages, 39 instances of where I was a racist, you see. Such things as the Ashantis came through the bush and were mown down by the rifles of the Black Watch. Like that, you see. The Zulus disemboweled dead enemy. They didn't like me saying that. And they were all things that were facts. But these people didn't want to know, because they were looking at history with today's mind and with hindsight. They didn't, in the long term, they didn't want to know that their races, coloured people, were ever beaten by white people. You see? And at the end of the letter, at the end of the list, they said, if Donald Featherstone was a coloured gentleman and he bought one of his books and read it, how would he feel about reading that his ancestors were savages, barbarians, uncivilized or heathens? Well, I did use those terms, but in relation to Ashantis and Kaffirs and dervishes and that, they were reasonable descriptions as they were seen at the time, you see. So I wrote back when I had to rebut all these things. I was furious about it, but the publishers insisted on my rebutting them. So I wrote at the bottom of my rebuttal, I said, if Donald Featherstone was a coloured gentleman and he bought this book and read that his ancestors had invariably showed such courage and dignity in the face of overwhelming military technology and superiority, he would be very proud. And this was the case. If you look back at Victorian colonial wars, I don't think there is an example when the native enemy didn't display courage and dignity in the face of terrible losses. There's numerous reports about dervishes in the Sudan attacking squares, and when they were beaten, they didn't turn around and run away or anything. They turned their back and they walked away in a dignified way. Take the Battle of Omdurman, 1898, Kitchener's Dongola campaign. Kitchener faced an army of 45,000 men, the Khalifa's men. They killed 16,000 and they wounded 25,000 of them. It was the biggest wiping out of an army in modern history. And Kitchener was going along the back of the line, the men were so firing happily, boom, 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 going, stop firing, stop wasting ammunition, he was saying. Now, you know, it's very hard to reproduce this in a war game. I'm bringing this in, it's an incidental thing, but I think it has its interest to us. You've got to consider the mobility of your troops. You've got to consider that cavalry armies like Huns and Mongols, and how fast did they move in comparison with the people they're fighting. You've got to think about mobile foot soldiers like Zulus or dervishes who weren't encumbered with things. How did they get on? Which makes people not very happy about surrendering if they're going to lose the same number of guys. Weather. What about weather? You can have seasonal weather cards. I mean, we've just seen this great heat wave here. Now, if a heat wave suddenly struck a force advancing of European troops who weren't used to the heat, for example, that would affect. Do you alter your rules to allow for this? Is it a campaign or what? You have rules that say that they're tactical rules, so that the river's risen, you can't go. When we were in Italy, we were attacking across the river up the Gothic line with the Duke of Wellington's regiment, and we put them over. And then we were coming through the river, we had flamethrower tanks in, and we were supposed to come through this shallow river, and there was this terrible downpour, and we couldn't get over. And flamethrower tanks weren't any good at 150 yards range, and these guys were about 3/4 of a mile over. And they all got captured, the whole of the battalion, because we couldn't get over to help and support them from the river guys. What about surprise? Now, we have one unique factor in wargaming. We are God, aren't we? The God factor. We're standing looking down. You can see all. All is laid out before you. See? Now, I know there are dozens of ways of all shit. You're probably all sitting there and you're all saying to yourself that, yes, well, I do this, well, I do it that way. But it's very difficult to do. Concealment is very difficult on a wargame stage. Well, I mean, I know you can say, right, ambushes, you get a coloured pin with a green head and you stick it in the middle of a bush and that's this bunch of guys ambushing it. Unless you see the pin, you've had your chips when you get up level with it. I mean, you can do all that. You can wear dark glasses with them. I used to know some guys who used to take the bulbs out, put blue bulbs up and put dark glasses on it. Surprise. Surprise is another factor that's hard to see. What about the cavalry coming out of the smoke? That's a tactical surprise. What about major surprises, as on D-Day when the Germans ran out? I think we were coming across the Pas de Calais, and that Patton's Third Army was stationed in Kent waiting to come over, whereas the whole thing was completely different. What about Alamein? One very simple way we used to do in the old days, but it's too much faking to do, so we don't do it now. We used to put across the table, hang across the table, we had a cord across, and we used to have this thing, semi-transparent plastic, almost opaque, and you could just see the guys the other side. You couldn't see really what they were doing. And the thing was, you see, you'd be behind a sheet of plastic, and you'd be standing there like this, and you'd be going like that with one hand, and you'd be moving the two. And I mean, it's a fun thing, really. You can have corny things like playing cards. You draw up a plan and tactics, and down to brigade unit level, you've got 8 cards, and you draw, and the proposed move can be, you write down your move, and you can change it if you draw an ace, and all that sort of thing. But then you're getting down to my similar situation needing an abacus. You can have inaccurate maps. I do that sometimes. I work a war game out for my guys, and I give them a map. It's nothing like the terrain. I sit them downstairs with all their troops and tell them to lay them out. They go upstairs and say, well, where's the terrain? Well, this is it. I'm sorry. This guy did these maps, wasn't a very good cartographer. One side has a good map, one side has a bad map. That's quite fun too. Military possibilities. Now, military possibilities are very good in that you look at a situation and you say, right, this could have happened or that could have happened. For example, you can say, Blucher didn't arrive at Waterloo. Or you can say that this lot over there want to send a message to that lot, and the courier doesn't arrive. And then you can, if you want, you can have courier cards and just stick with them, which say that his horse is lame or he got ambushed by the local population who didn't like him or something. You can do all that sort of thing, you see. You can have situations like, I mean, these are local tactical things which you just bring it along. That can be part of your rules. That's part of it. You can have dew as wet as your bowstrings or your gunpowder. All those sort of things. Well, I mean, you could go on crazy, but what we're doing, we're really only considering the sort of the nitty-gritty of wargaming. There's far more to it than that, because after all, gentlemen, let's face it, wargaming isn't just a game, it's a social exercise. It brings you here and me here, and it brings us all together, and having discovered wargaming, it's a sad life, wouldn't it? Thank you very much. Happy to answer any questions, but please, if you're going to ask them, stand up and shout. Anything? If there's not anything, well, let's all go down the bar. If you want to come and talk to me or sign books or anything, you're right.
Can we take a photograph? Do you take a photograph? Can you allow us to take a photograph?
Of course, yes.
Not in the nude, Don. Not in the nude.
Us or him? You have a new book coming out? I heard a rumor to that effect.
Yeah, you're my publicity man.
Am I? I'd like to be paid.
Book, did you?
No, I hear you have a new book or a novel coming out. Is that true?
Yes, yes. I wrote a book about 15 years ago called Tales from a Victorian Barrack Room, which I think is the best thing I've ever written. It was fiction, and I couldn't get it published. Everybody, I got 49 letters at home from publishers, all signed by women. Dinky this and Deirdre that, Samantha somebody else. It isn't the right sort of thing. And a friend of mine in Southampton, he was the head salesman of British Telecoms, and he took early retirement. And as is the custom, I don't know in our country, I bet over here, he walks away with about £120,000 in his warm little hand. See, well, he's only in his late 40s, so he's opened up a couple of military bookshops, and I recommend if there's any military books you're looking for, you can't get this. I'll give you this guy. This guy is brilliant at finding them. He really is. And there's a lot of stuff in England probably that you might want that wouldn't necessarily go over here. Anyway, he had written a couple of books for David and Charles one about crossing the Seine in 1944, and there's Anderlecht, and the other one about the Rhine crossing in March 45. And he'd been over there and done a hell of a lot of research and gone over the ground. And they were very good books. They were definitive. And he was looking forward to them being reprinted. Well, David and Charles got bought out by Reader's Digest. And Reader's Digest seemingly got a Quaker background or something, and they cut the military list out altogether. So there were 2 or 3 of my books didn't be reprinted. And old Ken Ford, he didn't get his 2 books in. He was so upset with this that he started a publisher's, which he called Valder, after his life. And he had his 2 books done. Brilliantly done, professionally, hardcover. They look better than the original. And he took them to the Nuremberg Book Fair, which is the big thing in Europe. And he took 500 copies of each, and he sold the lot. They bought 500 copies of a book about defeating the Germans in English. And he was asked to give a talk on it in the town hall in Nuremberg, which he did. He made so much money out of it, he came back, he said, I'm going for this in a big way and I want to do your novel. So he took my novel there, and he's got big ideas. He's got some television he's talking about. But, I mean, I know I'm not trying to sell you this idea, I'm just talking about it because it's very close to my heart. This book of mine, I have a great emotional feeling for soldiers, for British soldiers. I don't mean that I'm gay or anything, I've just got a great emotional underlying feeling for what makes soldiers tick. And the Victorian soldier, to me, is someone that I find his life was such a checkered, hard thing from 1837 to 1901 when the Queen lived, that he fascinates me, and I've put quite a bit in my books, like All for Shilling a Day and Out of the Fire and that, and I've always wanted to write about it. So I had this idea about a British infantry regiment in India in 1868, when in those days, when the hot season came, nobody did anything during the day. The infantry, they had a 4 a.m. reveille, and they drilled until 8, and then they went in their barrack room, they had their breakfast in the barrack room, they were shut in the barrack room until 6 at night. And they just lay on their beds in these bungalows with the punka fans just whirring above there, and they just lay on their beds and sweated and talked and argued and rowed and everything. I mean, you can imagine it, can't you, what it was like, day after day, year after month after year after year. Well, there's these guys there, and the sergeant in charge of the barrack room gets a fit of hot weather madness. He puts a snider in his mouth, blows the top of his head off, and in the little rush matting cubicle, the sergeant's cubicle at the end of the hut, and all the muck against the heavily laden British. Because when you go abroad and you look at these battlefields, when you go to Spain or Portugal, for example, and you drive along these dusty roads, and you come mile after mile with your maps there, and you say, turn right down there, and that's Albuera, and you go up there, and that's Salamanca, that sort of thing. And every now and then it dawns on you that those guys marched every inch of that way on their flat feet, with their overcoats and all their ammunition, and wearing clothes that aren't the sort of lightweight stuff we wear. They were going to action in the same sort of thing, right up the Crimea. They were going to action the same sort of thing. They were wearing on parades and show parades. You see the Light Brigade charge at Balaclava, the same gear they would have worn if they were doing a parade at Aldershot. And I was at Aberdeen Proving Grounds the other day, a couple of days ago, and Mr. Atwater there was showing me some weapons, and I was hefting an Enfield, and we put the bayonet on everything. Have you ever lifted an Enfield? You know, the weapon the British soldier was given during the Crimean War. And when you think of the weight of it, and this bayonet on the end, you've got all the rest of your stuff, I was astonished with it. And you've got to bear in mind too that a weapon like the Enfield, which came into being in 1854, it was the first weapon the British soldier had put in his hands that was as effective as the longbow that was used at Cressy in 1346. The range of the longbow and the effects of the arrows of the longbow, up to the advent of the Enfield, the Brown Bess to some extent was a little better, but still the longbow was a more effective weapon. But of course you have to train hard. It's much easier to fire a gun than it is to learn to fire a longbow. You take a Foreign Legion, you read about the Foreign Legion, there's 70 pounds of kit marching across the desert there. And, well, you know, are you going to represent it in war games, or are you just going to make it a matter of interest? How about treachery? Treachery is fun, isn't it? Now, what do? Do you have an acknowledged treacherous situation on the table where you know that these units, if they throw a 3, they're going to go over the enemy? What do? Now, we had a game the other week in England, which, see, I try to give my guys who come on Wednesday night, I try to give them something different each time, something hunting. So we had this Peninsular War game, and there was a French force attacking the Light Division. Now there's the Light Division with the categories and the 93 Battalions and the 95th Rifles, with the 43rd and the 52nd there, and they had 2 guns of Ramsey's artillery. There they were positioned on about a quarter of the table in the middle like that, in a nice shot position, you see. And facing them, right along the table, is this bloody great big force. So my best friend said, yeah, I don't like those odds. Straight away, I mean, you're doing it, don't you? I don't like those odds. You always try to get an advantage. You always try to bow-brick the guy into giving you a few more men or taking a few off the other side. So I said, it'll work out all right, you see. So off we started. Now, the French had their normal French unit, and they had a big division of Spaniards. These Spaniards had decided, well, we're with the French, you see. They'd come up from Madrid, and there they were, and they were the right wing. Now, I had Spaniards. I made sure of that. And the guy was commanded in the middle. He said, we'll go forward. He said, I want you to take a big force of Spaniards. He said, right round and come in on the flank. He said, we'll keep them occupied frontally while you go round. Right. So I gradually moved my troops further and further over to the right on the end of the world, up against the wall at the end of the table. He said, what are you doing? What are you doing? I said, I'm out flanking them. He said, you don't have to go that far. I said, don't worry. So I was so far out that they couldn't fire on me, and I didn't fire on them, you see. But this game went on about 7 or 8 moves, you see. And he said, going forward like that. And I get right round so that I'm right on the flank of the Light Division. Oh, and at the start of the game, I gave the bloke representing Crawford, commanding the Light Division, I gave him a missive, sealed missive, you see. And I said, this is for you, and he's not to be told to anybody else. And it was from the Duke of Wellington to General Blackwell Crawford. And it said, have a care with the Spaniards, they are not what they seem. So when I got my Spaniards right up there, we started the next move, and I said, I'm surrendering. What do you mean you're surrendering? I had a white flag, I stuck this white flag down. What do you mean you're surrendering? I said, I'm going over at the other side. I said, we don't really like you. Can't do that. Well, I am. So I turned my huge Spanish division around and started firing back. In. I like Division 1 easily. Make friends amongst them, though. Going from the cylinder, take simulation of modern warfare and warfare strategy. Now, I was down at the Aberdeen Proving Ground the other day, and I was talking to the guy I was with, Dave Paddock, and we were discussing the tanks, and I was showing him the Panther tank. Now, I was in Italy, and I remember at a place called Forlì, just before Christmas '44, they put a great big collection of all captured and knocked out German tanks at the town square at Forlì. And I remember there was this Panther there, and it had all the Zimmerite on the side, you know, the anti-stick stuff and everything. And I'd never seen these tanks as close as that, thank God. And I looked at it, and I looked at this Panther, and I was so impressed, because the thing about the Panther was there is not a single flat plate taking impact. Now, we had Churchills, flat sides of the turret and everything like that. We had 3.5 inches of armour. But we used to get 88mm shells go inside our turrets through 3.5 inches. I've seen this at the Hitler 9 at Casino there. We tried this, we got a great big branch. There was this turret and had a hole in it like that. Now the 88 had gone in, it had cleared the turret like shaking a marble around in a muck. And there were the 3 guys who were dead inside there. And it had come out the other side. Now, you would think, wouldn't you, that it would go in and it would kill everybody and then go out. It didn't. It went round and it came out at another angle. You couldn't put this thing through, you couldn't put this branch through so that it went in that hole and came out that hole, because it went in, it came out that. And that was the power, that was the velocity of that particular thing. And there's an interesting thing, complete diversion, but you might be interested in this. When a tank burns, you've got the crew of 3 in the turret, and somebody usually doesn't get out. You've got your 2 men down the front. When a tank burns, after it's burnt, and you climb up and look at it, and you look down on the turret there, it's all ash and everything down there. And they're the guys who burn. Teeth don't burn. And in the middle of all this ash, there's the sets of teeth of 3 young men who've practically all their teeth. That's a lot of teeth. And there's all these white teeth hanging around in the ash. And that's quite a shaker when you first see it. I remember the first time I saw that. It shook me. Anyway, in wargaming, you've now got to get a situation where you make it so that if you're firing at something, you've not got a direct hit. If you're firing at an angle on a straight surface, you can get it like that. You've got a glance. But say you're firing an angle at a slanting thing. You see, now you've got to make allowances then. Now that isn't easy. You've got to start getting a bit technical. You've got to know what you're doing to be able to simulate that realistically as a war game. And it's another one of the things that we've got to work on. Now, what about surrendering? You have surrendering in wargaming. What can you do? I mean, one just throwing a suggestion. Then you could have a double strength attacking force can demand the surrender, and defenders can fight off the attack by throwing over 5 on the dice or 50 on the dice. So we have percentage dice, 1 to 10. We throw over 50. I mean, you can make that an enforced rule. They've got to do that, but it's not really very, very satisfactory. Prisoners of war. There's no inducement in wargaming to take prisoners, is there? I used to know a wargamer, a very sympathetic, sort of soul-searching type of guy, was the leading partner. He always wanted to take prisoners. And I said, well, what about prisoners? Why don't they give up? And he said, there's no rules for it, Charlie, there's no rules for it. I suppose you can ally it to the surrender rule I've just talked about. And we did it once or twice, and the rule we made was, yes, you can surrender, or somebody can surrender, but the people you surrender to have got to march up the table, and they've got to march off with 1 man escort for every 1 man who surrenders. And blood is still on the roof there. And there's a Sergeant Ben Oakley, who has been in married quarters for 16 years, at breakfast time one day, his wife and children didn't feel well, and by noon they died of cholera. And the Colonel's lady sympathises with him and says, of course you realise, Sergeant, that you're no longer entitled to live in married quarters, you must go back to barracks. So he's put in this barrack room, in this hut, you see, in this cubicle in the barrack room. And there he is every day. And he can hear everything these men say out there. Well, as service guys know, they know out there, he can hear, and he knows, they know, he knows. and they air all their little grievances. They're all lying in their beds. And I said, see, Charlie's on guard again tonight then. Been on twice this week, hasn't he, you see? Sergeant ought to do something about it, you see, and that's the way it goes, you see. And there he is, and he's hearing everything and every word, and they're lying there and they're talking about, do you remember old Chalky White, the ferocious Shah, do you remember this, all that going on, you see, and he's listening to it, and there's a bit more educated soldiers with a bed just near his cubicle, and he sees the sergeant standing in the doorway listening. He says to him, a bit like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, isn't it, Sergeant? So I said, don't know what you mean, lad, who's Chaucer? So he said, well, he was a man who wrote in the Middle Ages about the pilgrims going to Canterbury, and they used to tell each other stories to lighten the journey. So the sergeant thinks to himself, well, our journey's tough enough here. I mean, the only way we're going to get out of this barrack room during the day between now and the end of the hot season is if we have to go up the frontier. Because there's just some trouble up there, and that'll be tough enough. So he thinks, if we could, these guys have all got stories in them, he's been listening to them. And he said, I'm going to persuade them to tell stories that they'll all listen to. So he tells them the first story. He says to them, look, he said, you don't have to listen, go to sleep tonight. I want to tell you a tale about when I was a young soldier. And he tells them a story called Briggy's Monkey. And it goes down quite well, and gradually they get round to telling stories. And there's other little instances in it, you know, outside the story. I think one day one of the guys says, wouldn't it be nice if Christmas came twice a year? So they have Christmas in July in the barrack, and things like that, you see. I've tried to get underneath the skin of these soldiers, and to make it even more Featherstone, every single man in the book, every name in the book is the name of a man who served with me in my regiment. So anyway, there you are. You don't have to buy it, but I like writing it. Thank you. Well, thanks very much, gentlemen, for this. I love talking to you all about this, and you're such a good audience. And I'll embarrass you and embarrass myself by saying I've never, since I've been coming to America for about 10 years, I've never met an American I haven't got on with, or I've been friendly and warm to them. And I appreciate that very much. Thank you very much.
That's what I like.
Come back.
Yeah.
Oh, gee, what a great idea.
Yeah, and it's a great idea. Actually, there's a lot of benefits to doing it around for anybody who does any kind of research at all.
Just prior to the first Guards Grenadiers taking it from the grade, remember the Marylanders did rout the second Guards Grenadiers. So at Guilford Courthouse, yes sir, they came off the hill and they sent the second Guards packing, and the first Guards came in and they were tired. Being a Marylander, I have to defend the honor of my state. Thank you.
All right, we'll see you. Yeah. What room are you in?
We can use it in that way. You can, when they access it.
That's my name, Dick.
They're always services. I like the World Library. Nobody. Initials now.
Oh, okay.
We're in 164. Nice library headquarters road. It's a hyphenated road.
So it inevitably gets cut off from all the mailing lists because it just.
Yeah, I had a similar idea, but not on such a global scale. I just couldn't afford to start off with a focus that size. It's just
Well, even as a chief officer,
Thing is, we have got this portling in the earth, push your own battlefield, and once we have done something,
so many non-friendly guys out here will do this. You see, one of the things that certainly you as Americans and us as Brits, you say things like that, and you mean it. In Britain, if people say to you, why don't you come and stay with me? I think, oh, sorry, that's all right. What they really mean is, that'd be nice, but for God they don't come.
No, we would enjoy it. I mean, there's enough Civil War fans around. Next time you get a chance, we'll take care of it.
Pardon me?
I
don't think so. Yeah, there's a lot of, there's been certainly quite a large number of reprints on the OR. And they sell out rapidly.
So we're going to take up these vast sitting at home, you don't have to come to a convention and have these groups battle.
Oh, yeah.
All in this fog of war where you would be able to see all.
So you don't have any figures or anything really?
he was up there and he just left.
Although if you want to. So, I mean, AT&T is in that.
Right.
All these things are mind-boggling. I was at Dayton, Ohio the other year at the museum there, and I saw the Wright brothers airplane.
Are you
And I
good
realised
keeping
the
all
Wright
this,
brothers
all
airplane
seminars?
No, just
got off the ground only 15 years before I was born.
He's the one that's worthwhile.
It's amazing, isn't it?
I just hold on to them, and if anybody ever asks for them, I'll have them.
Little hill
Yes.
where you can see
Excellent.
the place, the
Well, let me
bunks
give
they
you my
slept
card.
in while they were
sure.
designing their gliders. You could hear the wind howling in the middle of
What's
November.
this?
I have small
Kill Devil
faith in my
Hill,
daughter's
Wright
for being
Memorial
able to pick up
Museum. North Carolina, right on the beach.
I've seen their shop at Greenfield, you know, Henry Ford's museum there in.
Well, there's a big museum there, and it's all about the first flight. The place is called First Flight. It's a National Park Museum. They even have the barracks that the guy slept in when they reproduced the sound of the wind howling in November. And the whole
What's really
thing.
funny is that the mound that they launched the plane on was only hardly into the.
Wasn't there a big hill around?
I know your name, restaurant.
WWII. I write for it quite a bit. I do all the.
Oh, yes, of course, yes. Yeah, I knew your name. Yeah.
That's all.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Featherstone,
Yes.
Bill Mazzocco. My son James.
Hello, James. Oh, you Wargamer?
Well, we're kind of starting to get into it. We had got your introduction to Wargaming book, and we had seen that, led us to come down here. And I was wondering if you would sign our.
Of course, yeah.
This is for you. There's some letters in there for you.
Oh,
And there's some souvenirs for you.
Thank you, Jim. I'll see you around.
Oh, yeah.
Going now.
Where are you going?
Come and have a drink.
Okay, we'll be with you.
Okay. If you want me to put it to anybody, to
James and.
James. What's it? James what?
James Mazzocco, Mazzocco.
Sorry you asked now, aren't you?
N-I-Z-Z. Yeah. O-C-C-O. I'm sorry if I have to ask that, but some of your names are a little bit strange to me.
I understand.
Where does that name come from?
Italian,
Oh, yeah.
but we're French, German, Irish, Italian. He's
Yeah.
French, German, Irish, Italian.
Have you lived in
Polish.
Italy
So
yourself?
Central European.
Yeah. No, we went back there when I was in the service.
Yes.
But,
Oh, this is. I was in a Italian restaurant in London back at the beginning of May, and it was the day of the Easter, you know. And the Italian proprietor came along, and he was serving me. So we've been there before. So I said to him, I know exactly where I was 50 years ago today. Oh, where was that? So I said, I was in Padua. Oh, Padua, he said, oh, it's in the north. He said, I'm from the south. I said, where? place. He said, oh, a village near Naples. So I said, well, try me. He wouldn't. I said, well, try me. I was down there. I thought, he said, at Caserta, near Caserta. So I said, that's where the royal palace is. And there used to be a big lake outside. We used to swim in it. And so I was there 6 months. Oh, right. I said, well, we lived in Madarone. Madarone, this is my village, she said. So we got free drinks.
Well, thank you very much.
Well,
Thank you. Thank you.
Enjoy yourself, James. It's a good hobby.
It is.
Yeah.
Would you like to go up to the bar and sign these, or?
Yeah, we could do that, couldn't we? You coming up the bar, Jim?
Right.
Yeah, let's go up the bar. We do it up there, shit. So I'm a bit dry. So. How did it go, Jim?
Wonderful as usual.
Nice of it. You know, there's one or two guys sort of yawning and looking a bit sleepy. I wonder whether I was going a bit too long.
Oh, did I steal your pen?
No.
I think that's actually mine.
Where's my
What's this like? It doesn't say Microsoft on it, so what's it?
No,
This might be of use to you in connection with what you're doing. That was in the London paper recently, the 10th of June. That was in the London Daily, the National Daily Telegraph.
can I copy this, or?
You can keep it.
Oh, well, thank you, sir. Thank you very
I
much.
did some copies and brought them over because I thought some of my friends might be interested.
Well, thank you, sir.